Hey everyone! Welcome back to the English Learning Podcast. I'm Emily, and with me today, as always, is John. Hi, John.
Hey, Emily. Hey, everyone. Today's topic is one that a lot of learners struggle with: how to think in English. It's a big milestone in language learning and really helps take your fluency to the next level.
Exactly. Thinking in English can make you more confident, faster in conversations, and less reliant on translating everything in your head. But it's not easy, especially when you're just starting out.
Totally. We're going to talk about the challenges people face when trying to think in English, how to figure out what's holding you back, and some strategies you can use to start making that shift. Plus, we've got a great story from one of our listeners who's been through this journey. Sound good?
Let's dive in.
So let's start by talking about why thinking in English can feel so hard. Emily, what's one of the biggest challenges learners face?
I think one of the main challenges is habit. Most people are used to thinking in their native language, and that habit is deeply ingrained. It's not something you can change overnight. When you're always translating from your first language, it slows down your thought process and makes speaking feel harder.
Exactly. And then there's the fear of making mistakes. Learners often feel that if they think in English, they'll get it wrong. That fear creates a mental block.
Right. Another challenge is lack of vocabulary. If you're always searching for the right word, it's tempting to fall back on your native language. That's when translation creeps in, and suddenly you're back to thinking in your first language.
Plus, many learners say that when they do try to think in English, their thoughts just don't flow naturally, which can feel frustrating. It's important to remember that this takes practice. It's a process.
Exactly. And the good news is, once you identify these challenges, you can start working on them. Speaking of which,
Let's talk about how to figure out what's holding you back from thinking in English. The first step is recognizing when and why you switch back to your native language.
yes, a lot of people switch back when they hit a mental block, like when they don't know a word or a phrase. Noticing those moments can help you understand where you need to focus your learning.
Another thing to watch for is self-doubt. If you're constantly second-guessing yourself, it's hard to stay in English mode. A lot of learners get stuck because they're too focused on perfection.
Exactly. But here's the thing. You don't need to be perfect to think in English. In fact, it's better to make mistakes and keep going than to freeze and translate. So, notice when self-doubt kicks in, and remind yourself that it's okay to make errors.
Also, pay attention to your environment. Are there specific situations where it's harder to think in English? For example, some people find it easier when they're alone, but switch back to their native language when they're around friends or family.
Yes, and once you know what triggers you to switch back, you can start tackling it head-on. All right, now let's get into some strategies. How can you start shifting your thinking to English? John, what's a good place to begin?
One of the best strategies is to narrate your day in English. As you go about your daily tasks, describe what you're doing in English, even if it's just in your head. Like, I'm making coffee, I need to send an email, it's time to leave for work. It builds your habit of thinking in English.
Yes, it sounds simple, but it works. You're training your brain to process everyday actions in English. Another great tip is to label objects around your house. If you're cooking, think about the names of the ingredients in English, or even label them with sticky notes.
That's a fun one. Another strategy is to use word associations in English. If you come across a new word, try to connect it with other words you know. For example, if you're learning the word apple, think about fruit, red, healthy, and so on. This creates a web of words in your mind, making it easier to think in English.
And you can also try speaking to yourself in English. This could be out loud or in your head. Pretend you're having a conversation, or even practice responses to common questions. The more you practice, the more natural it becomes.
Absolutely. And for those who love reading, one of my favorite strategies is to read and summarize in English. After reading a paragraph or chapter in English, try to summarize it, either in writing or just mentally.
Such a good strategy. It forces your brain to process the information in English rather than defaulting to your native language. And finally, try watching English TV shows or listening to podcasts without subtitles. Then explain what you understood in your own words. It's a great way to immerse yourself. And now let's share a story from one of our listeners, James, who struggled with thinking in English and eventually made the switch. Here's what he told us. James writes,
I moved to the UK a few years ago, and at first I thought I'd pick up thinking in English quickly. But it didn't happen. I was still translating everything in my head and felt frustrated because I couldn't keep up in conversations. I realized I was switching back to my native language because I was too afraid of making mistakes. Every time I hit a word I didn't know, I'd freeze. But then I started narrating my day in English, just like you suggested in one of your episodes. I'd talk to myself while cooking, driving, even when shopping. It felt strange at first, but after a couple of months, it became second nature. I wasn't thinking about the words anymore. They just flowed. What helped most was allowing myself to make mistakes without getting stuck on them. Now, I even dream in English sometimes.
That's awesome. Thanks to James for sharing his story. His experience really shows how important it is to let go of the fear of making mistakes. Emily, what stood out to you from his story?
For me, it was the way he used self-narration. That's such a powerful tool. Like he said, it felt awkward at first, but the more he did it, the more natural it became. It's all about building that habit.
Exactly. I also love that he mentioned dreaming in English. It's a sign that he's really internalized the language, but that didn't happen overnight. It took patience and consistent practice. So for anyone listening, remember that it's a process, but it's possible.
Definitely. And his point about not getting stuck on mistakes is so important. If you're always afraid of getting it wrong, you'll never feel comfortable thinking in English. It's about progress, not perfection. So if someone's just starting out with thinking in English, where should they begin? John, what would you suggest?
Start with small, manageable tasks. Begin by narrating a few simple activities in English, like making breakfast or getting ready in the morning. Don't try to do too much at once. Build it up gradually.
Yes, and I'd add to that. Focus on building vocabulary that's relevant to your life. If you know the words for everyday things, it's easier to think in English without getting stuck.
Good point. Another great place to begin is with low-stakes situations. Practice thinking in English when there's no pressure, when you're alone or doing something routine, like exercising or cleaning. That way you can build confidence without feeling rushed or judged.
And don't forget to track your progress. Notice the moments when you successfully think in English without translating, even if it's just for a few seconds. Celebrate those small wins, because they'll add up over time.
Exactly. It's all about momentum. And if you're feeling stuck, revisit the strategies we talked about earlier. Self-narration, labeling objects, reading and summarizing. The more consistent you are, the faster you'll start noticing progress.
One last thing. If you ever catch yourself thinking, "I'll never be able to think in English," challenge that thought. Remind yourself that every bit of practice gets you closer. It's a mindset shift. And once you believe that thinking in English is possible, you'll be more motivated to make it happen. Let's do a quick recap of today's episode. We started by talking about the common challenges learners face when trying to think in English, like habits from their native language, self-doubt, and lack of vocabulary.
Then we covered how to identify what's holding you back, whether it's translating in your head, perfectionism, or specific environments where it's harder to stay in English mode.
Next, we dove into strategies you can start using today to shift your thinking to English. We talked about self-narration, labeling objects, word associations, and practicing conversations with yourself. We also heard James's inspiring story about how he overcame his struggles by using those strategies.
And finally, we discussed where to begin. Start small, focus on the vocabulary you need for daily life, and practice in low-pressure situations. Remember, this is a gradual process, so be patient with yourself.
Thinking in English isn't something that happens overnight, but it's absolutely within your reach. By staying consistent, letting go of perfectionism, and enjoying the process, you'll start noticing those mental shifts. Soon enough, thinking in English will become second nature.
That's right. So if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to the English Learning Podcast for more tips and strategies like these. And let us know, what's your biggest challenge when it comes to thinking in English? We'd love to hear from you.
Thanks so much for joining us today. Keep practicing, keep pushing yourself, and we'll see you next time.